Was there an Adam? Was there an Eve? Or did we evolve from what we conceived? Either way, we got what we needed when the sun shone down on the Garden of Eden.
Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia, Solartopia, Solartopia. Don't you know we're gonna have a Solartopia all over God's green world?
Well, we bit that apple and the garden was lost, and so we had to work to pay the cost. And so we went digging into the ground and started to burn many things we found. But
yeah, we did.
You know we're gonna
Started to burn too many things we found. That's the wonderful Dar Williams singing with the legendary Pete Seeger and David Burns, the brilliant lyricist who wrote the words to that song, except for the word Solartopia, which I wrote. I'm Harvey Sluggo Wasserman, back with you all for another hour here at the Green Power and Wellness Show. I'm PRN. I want to thank the crew in New York for keeping us on the air, and we are going to talk about two things today. We're going to talk about election theft and the need to secure our electoral process for the coming elections, if we have them, if there hasn't been a military coup before the 2020 election. And we're going to talk about Diablo Canyon, the nuclear power plant here in California, that's in a very unique situation, and I'm going to explain it because I've got two really brilliant guys coming on the show. Bob FITRAKIS, are you with us?
I'm here, Harvey.
Bob, good to have you. You are in Columbus. So how cold is it there? What's the deal?
It's 12 degrees, but the wind chill is about minus 12.
So you teach at Columbus State Community College, where I taught for many years. Are they open today?
No, they actually closed the last 2 days. It got as low as minus 29, but first time I recall it ever being closed 2 days in a row. So I've been busy working on the free press with my wife, Suzanne Patzer, the last 2 days, and Columbus State is in the big chill.
Wow, fantastic. So you're the publisher of the Columbus Free Press and the website freepress.org. How long have you been keeping that going? How long has that been on?
Well, I became the publisher in 1993. The publisher, which if anybody wants to do it, pretty much would give that up. That just means you got to come up with money if you can't put the paper out. But I've been editor-in-chief since 93 as well. And you're still listed, Harvey, as senior editor. You preceded me. You were writing at the Free Press before I got there.
Well, I'm even more senior now. I mean, God, I've been senior. I should get 2 or 3 seniors at least. 26 years. Steve Rosenfeld, are you on with us?
Yep. Hi, how's it going?
Steve, how you doing? You're in San Francisco. How's the temperature there?
Well, I don't want to say because I don't want to make
well, actually,
listeners
warmer.
Feel bad.
Yeah, it's warmer where I am, and I got to tell you, last night I listened. I have a show here in LA, Los Angeles, on KPFK 90.7 FM, but I do occasionally my dial slips to the classical station KUSC, and last night I can barely say this. The guy was complaining that the thermometer in LA never hit 70. He said the whole day it was all in the 60s, and well, he was really somewhat miffed. But nonetheless, and Steve, you are still writing. What is your gig now? Who are you writing for? And you got a book out, and tell us a bit.
I'm writing for this organization. It's a nonprofit called the Independent Media Institute. They used to publish Alternate, but Alternate was sold last spring. So they created a bunch of special projects, which they gave names to, for a handful of us reporters and writers. So they're calling my project Voting Booth. And what happens is, which is kind of silly, but that's what they did. But what happens is I write these pieces that are then distributed to a bunch of places, I would say, in the lefty media ghetto. So, depending on the receptivity of various editors. I can be on Salon, I could be at Alternate, I could be on Truthdig, I can be on National Memo, I can be on Common Dreams, I can be on, stuff like that. So that's what I'm doing.
And you have a book.
Yeah,
you have a book out about it.
It's interesting. The book came out literally a year ago, and it's called Democracy Betrayed, and which is kind of a shrill title. But really what it did was it looked at the anti-democratic features of the 2016 election. So it looked at what the Democrats did to Bernie, what the Republicans did to the Democrats, and then it looked at, what's happened since then in terms of these long-standing structural changes to, game the process. And it made some predictions about where things were going. And in many respects, it was like the work that you and I and Bob did a long time ago, in 2004 in Ohio, because it created a catalog of, injuries to the system, of which many of them are, addressed in this House Bill 1 that the Democrats are putting forward, and Mitch McConnell says, doesn't deserve to see the light of day.
Right. And as you'll recall, as I'm sure we'll both recall, and some of our listeners will recall, is that when we reported when it really happened in Ohio 2004, we were roundly attacked by the left. The Republicans didn't care, really. But we pointed out that the 2004 election had been stolen and this and that, and we were called all sorts of names by all sorts of wonderful leftists, and everything we said has certainly become true, proved to be true, and more. So we have an hour here, and I want to start off in a different mode. We're going to go very, very thoroughly into where we stand now in progressing with election protection and what the prospects might be for a fair election in 2020. And there couldn't be two better experts on that than Bob FITRAKIS and Steve ROSENFELD. I do, however, want to take a diversion here before we get into that to talk a bit about the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant here in California. And Bob is eminently qualified on this because you are an attorney and you've done quite a bit of environmental-oriented law. And Steve is, of course, in the Bay Area in the home of the Pacific Gas and Electric. So this is going to be a bit of a soliloquy. I'm going to give you about 10, 15 minutes at the most. But I do want to put this out there because this is the most, as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing happening in the country right now. What has happened is that Pacific Gas and Electric, which was once the biggest utility in the world, has gone bankrupt. And this is a monumental moment. It happened at midnight on Monday night, Tuesday morning. And given the size of PG&E, it has been bankrupt before. It went bankrupt in 2001, I believe it was, in the midst of the deregulation crisis, when Enron and the other players came in and just utterly ripped to pieces the electrical system and just gamed it. And it was one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history from the general public in California, which was the customers' electricity, to a bunch of guys sitting in a boiler room playing games with their computers. And they just absolutely raped and pillaged the California economy, and they drove PG&E and much else in California into bankruptcy. Today, California is still the biggest utility in California, PG&E, is bankrupt because of something we might want to call deferred maintenance. These guys have been allegedly delivering electricity to Northern California for many decades, even during and after the bankruptcy. And they don't take care of their ship. And they defer what they're supposed to do to the infrastructure into their own pockets, and then the public be damned. That's really what's been going on here. And in 2010, many things have happened as a result of this. The salient features are that in 2010, the city of San Bruno blew up. A neighborhood in San Bruno blew up because, literally, and caught on fire and burned, and 8 people were killed, and I think it was several dozen homes were destroyed because PG&E failed to maintain its gas lines. And they literally exploded with natural gas, and these houses were literally burned, and these people were literally incinerated. And these are American, probably upper-middle-class American tax-paying Californians. And PG&E has since been charged with criminal murder as a result of that. In 2015, there was a forest fire, and the deferred maintenance issue here is that they don't take care of their power lines. They don't clear the brush out from under the power lines. And then when the power lines fall over and they spark, the brush catches fire, and huge forest fires result. And this happened in 2015, and then hugely in 2017, and again in 2018. And thousands of acres of forest land have burned in 2017 and 2018. At least 80 people were killed, and at least 17 fires have been directly related to PG&E's negligence. And you, Steve Rosenfeld, living in the Bay Area, breathed the debris of that area for it was a good 10 days, right?
Yeah.
Really,
it's become an annual event, actually.
Yes, a horrific, absolutely horrific air. Now, I didn't personally experience it, but we did have some of it here in L.A. for 3 days when the Woolsey fire happened. And it was not fun, even though it was probably orders of magnitude less than what you had. Did you wear a mask?
I can just tell you, Harvey, for people who are, who are imagining, well, what is this really like? What's this really like? Unless you've lived through something like a hurricane or a tornado, you don't really know what it's like. The smoke detectors went off all over the place in people's homes, and they didn't know what was happening, and that was because there was particulate matter in the air. And then literally for a number of weeks, if you had the slightest sensitivity towards anything that's like allergy or lung or pulmonary related, you just could not breathe. You could not see straight. Your eyes wouldn't stop, your nose wouldn't stop, your chest would feel like something was stuck in there. And this is, that was the reality on the ground.
God, yes. And I have a friend, Mark Summer, actually from Columbus, who lives in the East Bay, on the 27th floor of a building, and his window faces the bay. And on a normal day, he could see 10, 15 miles, beautiful, pristine San Francisco Bay. The things, the stuff that legends are made of. And he said that during the fires, for a good 10 days, he had zero visibility. I could see nothing outside his window. And
what you're talking about, though, as far as the neglected maintenance, is something that you don't really hear that much about in the California papers. I mean, as you're saying, PG&E, they're always going for rate increases, and they're not doing this maintenance. And I know this segues.
Right.
Okay, now, how do we trust the nuclear plant?
Well, here's the deal now, and we'll do this for a bit, and then we'll move on. But the deal is now that there is a list of things at PG&E's Diablo Canyon nuclear power plants, units 1 and 2, in 9 miles west of San Luis Obispo. They have a list called deferred maintenance. And this is stuff that they've not been doing because they are scheduled to close in 24 and 25. And in addition to that, there are a number of tests at Diablo Canyon. Diablo Canyon Unit 1 will shut on February 3rd, which is Sunday, or thereabouts, to do a fuel outage. And it's the first time I know of in American history that a nuclear plant has gone down for a fuel outage while the company is in bankruptcy. And so we are now demanding here, and you can see I'm posting the memo at Solartopia.org. We are demanding that PG&E not be allowed to refuel this plant until a laundry list of things are done. And Steve, as I say, you're in California and writing, and Bob, you're an attorney. We're going to be before the bankruptcy judge. There's going to be a dynamic with the state versus the feds. I will do future shows on this, but if you're interested, listeners, email me directly at solartopia@gmail.com. And Bob and Steve, you're going to be getting the stuff on this, and we're going to move ahead with it. So I did want to lay that out. This is, to me, these are the two of the biggest nuclear reactors in the world. They are surrounded by earthquake faults. They are absolutely, as we learn with PG&E, they are absolutely badly maintained, and God knows what's going to happen there, but it's going to be a huge fight, and we'll do a lot of future shows on it. So I wanted to give my listeners a heads up, and you two guys, and we'll move ahead with it as we do. Okay, now, Bob and Steve, we have you on for the whole rest of the hour here, and I want to start with Bob in Ohio. Can you tell us, Bob, here in the heart of the stolen election beast, if it can be said to have a heart, what's been happening with election protection in Ohio, and what do you foresee for the 2020 election in this swing state that has decided so many presidencies?
Well, the former Secretary of State, who Steve knows quite well, John Husted, is now Lieutenant Governor. The last thing he did, his last major act on the way out of office, was to send notices of deregistration, an attempt to purge 267,000 voters, mainly in the urban area. So that's what he was doing. Federal judge had stopped him, a three-judge panel in an appeals court, where he had tried to literally purged, over a million voters since 2013, and he was stopped there. But there's been a real obsession on his part with inactive voters, which is really quite strange, right? If you don't carry your concealed weapon for 2 years, they don't take it away from you, or if you don't go to a rally, they don't take away your right to free speech. But there was a real obsession, which absolutely, totally made no sense, even though there were well-known apologists for it. Ned Foley, a professor at Ohio State Law School, said that it wasn't that bad. If you go back and purge people who haven't voted in the last two federal elections, or say in the last 6 years. But here's the question, Steve, as well as Harvey. Why don't you just keep track of these people? I mean, they're inactive voters. You've got a computer database, and you have to show ID in Ohio. If somebody doesn't want to vote, why is the solution in a ID state with massive computer power is to deregister them? And what's now happening, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, so there's a new Secretary of State, LaRose, a Republican, and he's saying some of the most rational things I've ever heard from a Republican in this state.
Well, are you sure that? I mean, do they know about him? Is he going to live? How did he get into the Secretary of State's office?
Well, he's kind of old school. Bob Taft and Sherrod Brown were the last two. Sherrod Brown and Bob Taft. There used to be this assumption up until Ken Blackwell, who ran the 2004 election. It used to be the idea that the Secretary of State's job was to register people to vote, not to purge people that'll vote against them or the party.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, of course, we're reminded of Yogi Berra's brilliant line, if people don't want to come to the ballgame, you can't stop them. But if they don't come for years and years and then suddenly they show up, you're not going to turn them away. So what is the upshot here? What's going to happen to all the people that, what's his name, Husted, deregistered? And is this new Secretary of State going to, what's his impact going to be?
Well, here's his quote in the Dispatch on Husted's system, and of course, being Blackwell's system. J. Kenneth Blackwell, co-chair of the Bush-Cheney re-election campaign, as well as Secretary of State. He says the old system, quote, it relies on 30 years of guess if someone died or moved. He says I want to rely on data the state already collects but doesn't share. It says, look, you renew your driver's license, you pay taxes, you take out fishing license. Why wouldn't, people die and the county recorder's office records it? Shocking revelation. You use the data of the state to find out who's eligible to vote, who lives where. You don't, hey, you haven't voted in 2 federal elections, you're deregistered, you're purged. We just took away a supposed constitutional right. So he's saying, look, we got all this information. All we got to do is check it.
Wow. So what are you predicting for the 2020 election? Is it going to be actually more fair if people wage voter registration campaigns? Are the people they register actually going to be able to vote?
Well, it'll really come down to how much the party leans on this guy, and again, what happens. But right now you've got all sorts of transparency problems, as well as Ohio under Husted, the existing law by a very reactionary legislature, pushed by John Husted, the former Secretary of State, essentially allows you with a notice card, which looks like bad direct mailing from the Secretary of State's office, to purge people if they hadn't voted in the last 2 federal elections. So that could actually be in the next year, right? If there's a primary and then a special election, you wouldn't be able to vote, even though it's only been less than a 2-year period. So that law is on the books. So we're really dependent in part in Ohio on whether this guy, LaRose, who seems to know that he shouldn't be purging voters, whether he's serious about actually registering voters. Ohio's had huge problems, the Democrats here, in 2 areas. The Mahoning County sort of deindustrialized former urban area, and also in southeast, the Appalachian counties that used to be very reliably Democrat since the New Deals have also switched, at least in the last election. Also, there was a drop-off of black voters in the urban area. So we've got problems there. There's other problems with transparency as well. The machines, we leave it up to the counties. Franklin County allows you to vote on paper. They also have a machine which they haven't decided to turn on the security features yet, that has ballot imaging as well as an audit. But in early election, they'll give you the choice to vote on a DRE, a direct, recording device for direct recording election results. And I don't see why you would do that. Totally non-transparent. You need a paper trail to count.
So, what is the status? We'll get to Steve Rosenfeld in a minute. In Ohio in 2020, how many people are going to be voting on machines or with paper that can actually give us a decent result? I mean, what's your assessment of what we can expect in Ohio in terms of the abilities for election theft and for shenanigans here?
Well, the problem is the state law does not. State law allows many of these counties, about 40% or so, to buy DREs without paper. They don't have to provide paper that can be recounted. And some of the major counties, there was 14 of them that had decided that while they had paper, they weren't going to turn on their security features. They weren't going to turn on their ballot images. They were going to reserve that. They were going to actually reprogram the machine instead of going with the default setting that does the ballot imaging and the auditing. So instead, they were going to use that for write-ins instead of counting creating a digital image of every single paper ballot, and also having an audit feature on that could actually look if there was an undervote, overvote, to see if everything was lined up and where those marks were on a piece of paper. So you could quite literally, if there were trouble, irregularities down to the precinct level, you could have checked it to make sure it matched the actual paper by having these ballot images. So right now, under Ohio law, case law, and the state statutes do not require that you turn on your security features, even if you have one of these digital balloting systems based on German banking technology, and they're good at, providing accurate results. So it really depends on what the County Board of Elections do. But who knows? Maybe this LaRose will issue a directive and, come up with some plan where you have to turn on your security features.
Well, maybe he'll meet with you. Have you met this guy?
No, but I intend to go over and say hi. I got to know John Husted, but can't say I was real popular over there.
All right. One last.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, Matt Damschroeder, the guy who was responsible for hiding machines in Franklin County in 2004, is now the director of all administrative services in the state of Ohio. So they say it doesn't pay to be corrupt, but Matt is now making a lot of money and responsible for all contracts and the administration of the state of Ohio.
Well, he was your student, so he still listens to you a little bit, right?
From over there at Columbus State.
Yeah. So one last question now. Gerrymandering in Ohio. Ohio is notorious for gerrymandering, but there's a 16 congressional seat, I think it was, delegation, and it was a 12-4 Republican, even though the state was divided roughly 50-50. What's happening with that? Wasn't there a anti-gerrymandering referendum that passed in Ohio?
Yeah, it's a peculiar one. It's not ideal. But what's going to happen is out of the two major parties, the majority party will get 3 votes on the gerrymandering board. The minor party will get 2. But no plan can go forward unless one of the 2 minority party members, and that's the Democrats right now, by a significant margin, if one of them has to vote with the majority Republicans in order for the plan to go through. So it looks like they've given veto power. Or another factor is if the second minority member is, say, from the Congressional Black Caucus, it was really the Congressional Black Caucus that gave the Republicans an extra seat when they swapped a new black seat in Columbus for a black representative for Kucinich's seat. So Joyce Beatty ended up with a brand new seat.
Yeah, so basically you've got a permanent 12-4 division in the state of Ohio unless something changes, right? And and again, it allows one of the Democrats that gets appointed as a minority party representative will have to agree with the gerrymandering plan. And the possibility there is the last time around it was the minority caucus that traded for a black seat, traded away Kucinich's seat, and really a 2-for-1 with Democratic seats being lost in exchange for a very solid, dense-packed black district in Columbus. Now, Steve Rosenfeld, have you been following the situation in Ohio? Is there anything you want to add?
No, I don't know it at the level that Bob knows it. I mean, I do think on this voter registration and voter purge thing, it's a fairly cynical game that's being played. The state of Ohio joined a consortium. I mean, I helped designed the plan for this in 2010, where those who join the states are supposed to identify every eligible voter in the state and make an effort to contact them to register them. They don't finish it up as automatic registration. That was the concession to conservatives who said you can't do it all for voters. But anyway, it's led to more voter registrations nationally than just about any other project, in the last decade. I mean, literally more than several million. But what ends up happening is, you've got like these really cynical moves, like Bob's talking about, where on the one hand, the state will take away something that then it's up to the next cycle of office holders or administrators to restore or give back. It's just really weird. I mean, it's not weird. It's really deliberate, and it's cynical, and it's really unnecessary. And you see it in a lot of other states, by the way, red states. So I'll give you an example. I mean, in Florida, you had felon reenfranchisement, possibly one of the most important results of the 2018 election, where 10% of the state's eligible registered voters were prevented from voting because of the Reconstruction era felony laws. Most of these folks were, pled guilty to some non-prison, drug felony or something, just crazy stuff like that. Well, the county supervisors of elections are opening registration for these people to register, but the state is not processing them. It's obviously going to be in court. It's going to first show up in the next couple of weeks because there are some municipal elections. It's the same thing. What's given is taken, and it has to be fought. So this is really cynical stuff, and it's all about preserving power.
Yes, absolutely. So it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as best I can see. Let's talk about gerrymandering for a minute. California, Steve, has my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, has a nonpartisan commission that establishes the congressional and the state districts, state legislative districts, Senate and House. And it's done in a nonpartisan way. My understanding is that it was actually sponsored in many ways by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who put in his personal money. I've seen one article that claims that Schwarzenegger put in $2 or $3 million of his own money to get this nonpartisan thing passed, because, of course, the Democrats were in a majority in California. They had the state totally gerrymandered. And now we have in California a legitimate nonpartisan districting commission that people seem to be pretty supportive of. What do you think? What do you know about that?
Well, the history you recite is true, and what's happened is, California is a super majority blue state, and there are reasons for that go beyond gerrymandering. So, so people might debate whether or not Republicans stand a chance here, and there are rural counties where Republicans are in the majority, but against the state's total population, they're not anywhere close to being a majority, or even like a half of one. But the thing is, the model of citizen-led commissions is been something that election reform people have looked to and have adopted in other states, because and they've done it by the initiative process, ballot initiative. So one of those passed in Michigan. And again, it had to, sort of make it over the rough waters of legal challenges, because you had a Republican incumbent government that didn't really want to have to share any power with Democrats. There was a similar thing, I think, that passed in Utah, and I think, if I recall, also in Missouri. Now, these are good signs, because what that means is that you'll have these commissions that will not be essentially all, one-side-dominated affairs. And because you have, at least in Michigan, you have a Democratic governor, what you'll have is the possibility of having just, more balanced, fair elections in the decade of the 2020s. Because what ends up happening with gerrymandering is you have these states with 50-50 splits, but one party that draws the maps ends up with 2/3 of the seats. And that's the story of this decade in Ohio, and North Carolina, and South Carolina, Pennsylvania. You can just go on and on and on. Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Georgia. So that's where citizen commissions come in. There's sort of a balancing, sort of solution or remedy.
So, as a Californian and an election protection expert, what's your assessment of how good or not good the California districting setup is, and would you advocate it for the rest of the country?
Well, I think it's good for the rest of the country. The thing is, I'm not in the best place to judge it in California because the state is such a blue supermajority state, and everything I've really looked at has been in other states where you really have 50-50 splits in statewide races, like for governor or for president, and then all of a sudden, their congressional delegations and their state legislatures are so completely out of sync with that. So, here I just think the process in general is better when you just don't have people rigging the rules from the inside. I mean, there'll always be people who will try to do that. It's just human nature, and the nature of politics. So, but I think that I think it bodes well in the places where it's being used or potentially will be used. And
okay,
because if you take a look at you take a look at what's going on in the world where election rules are created and defended or imposed, basically we see the Republicans everywhere refusing to cede power. Judicial elections, these governor things. Scott Walker tries to leave the state of Wisconsin, but not before the state legislature, tries to slap restrictions on the incoming governor, and it's just the same thing in North Carolina. This is just, this is the cornered rat theory of politics. These people are losing demographically, and they're doing everything they can to hold on, and some of these things they're doing are outrageous, and they're winning, like stacking the federal courts. That's a real nightmare.
Like that. A real nightmare. We're talking with Steve ROSENFELD in San Francisco and Bob FITRAKIS in Ohio, two of the leading election protection experts in the country. I believe a phone call. Did I hear that right? Somebody calling in? Go ahead. Caller, go ahead if you're here. Okay. All right, so we'll try again in a minute. Steve, you're going around the country now looking at developments in elections and election protection. I know, the gerrymandering case also, by the way, cuts the other way in Maryland. My understanding is that Maryland, the Democrats have completely gerrymandered the state.
No, they took one congressional seat. It's the one example. It's sort of a false equivalency. Yeah, they did it,
okay,
but it involved one congressional seat. When compared to the Republicans after the 2010 census, they basically grabbed some dozens of seats.
Yeah, well, and it seems like North Carolina has really been the most explosive of all the situations. They wound up with a Democratic governor. But the legislature, tell us, do you know what's going on there? Do you want to describe it? To me, it looks like completely amazing.
Well, it's the same thing as in Texas. You have these. Well, North Carolina is closer to being a real true purple state, and you've just had the state. Well, what happened was you had the state legislature come in. Okay, what happened was Obama got elected in 2008. A bunch of Republicans working with Karl Rove, they had a thing called the Red Map Project, and they realized that if they used really nasty campaigns, advertising in state legislative races, they could take back these state legislative chambers and then draw the maps for the decade that's almost over, the one that we're in now. And they did that. So they literally had these trifectas, Republican governors and both legislative chambers drawing these maps. And then what happened was, so that was 2011. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court guts the enforcement section of the Voting Rights Act, which basically said if you were previously covered because you had a history of discrimination, that any change in any voting law had to be approved by the Justice Department. So that's not just the entire South. It's a bunch of, there's some counties in Oakland, California, or some Oakland counties in California and New York, but it's mostly the South. So that just let the Republicans go crazy with passing at the legislative level everything you can possibly imagine to try to discourage voting by, the most obvious Democratic voting blocks. So that's gerrymandering, that's voter ID, that's the voter purges. It just goes on and on and on. And this is what's, and in North Carolina, you've had legal fights over these things where a federal judge will say that this was done with surgical precision. And that what happens there is that with gerrymandering, you're not allowed to segregate or draw districts based on a voter's race. That's illegal. But you're allowed to do it based on their partisan identity. But, in the South, race and partisan identity they're almost synonymous. So you have these insane legal arguments that just go on. And this is true with Texas, too, endlessly. So under the Obama administration, the Justice Department was fighting the state of Texas. Well, now this Justice Department is siding with the state of Texas. And it's just this crazy stuff that goes on and on and on, and it gets endlessly tied up in knots, and that just means the status quo is preserved. So, and
wow.
About gerrymandering, I should just let people know, it's like it gives you an 8 to 10% head start as an average when it comes to voter turnout, and that's how they win, because they look at the most reliable voters. So they took the McCain voters and they drew these districts. John McCain, who lost to Obama in the biggest shellacking, and they made sure that they would draw these districts where they would get 56, 57, 58% turnouts. And then they took the Democrats and they put them in districts where they would win with 70% turnout or 68 or something like that. And that's how you get these, states that are evenly divided, but have these congressional delegations and legislatures that are 2/3 Republican and 1/3 Democrat.
Right. Jesse, did we have a phone call? Did I hear correctly, or was that an illusion on my part? Okay, we'll proceed. So, now let's talk most importantly now about the real driving force of the desperation of the Republicans to rig the system, which is the demographic shift in the United States. We all know that by 2050, white people in the United States will be in a minority. And this is now certainly the reality in California. I believe it's the case in Texas, maybe Florida. Those are 3 of the biggest states in the country. Maybe even New York, we're getting close. And what's driven the blue state status of California, Steve, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that way back when Pete Wilson was running for governor and he was losing to Jerry Brown's sister, and decided the way to win was to really run a racist campaign against Hispanics, and it worked, and he won, except that he completely drove the entire Hispanic population of California into the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I covered that election.
Yeah, and California is now, 60%, close to 60% Hispanic, a very high population of Asian Americans, and, of course, African Americans, all of whom have been driven into the Democratic Party. And so the supermajority in California is really a product of the demographics here. And it's going to happen, and it's very close to happening now in Texas, as we saw with the Beto O'Rourke campaign. It should have happened in Florida. Andrew Gillum, I'm going to bet you, was the legitimate winner there. And it's basically a national phenomenon. I mean, you can say, Bob FITRAKIS, that the Republicans are holding on by their fingernails in the country as a whole, and certainly in many, many states. I don't think that Ohio has had the same demographic shift. But am I wrong in saying that's what, aside from the usual greed and power-hungry madness, that the Republicans are terrified of this demographic shift? Are you seeing it in Ohio, Bob?
Yeah, not as massive and significant. Ohio, really, what we saw was lower voter turnouts among blacks, which is part of the same problem. You talked about North Carolina. Remember, there was a federal appeals court that struck down in 2016 their very outrageous voter suppression laws, which my favorite quote from the Federal Appeals Court was it targeted black voters, quote, with almost surgical precision. And the Republican Party, right before the election, sent out a press release bragging that the closing of early voting hours had reduced the black vote by 8.5%. So the game in Ohio and many states, particularly with this shift going on with more people of color, so-called minorities, increasingly becoming a plurality and in some cases a majority, is that in that situation, the game is simply to suppress that vote. And in Ohio, remember the big move by John Husted, in the large urban areas, used to have at least 5 voting centers, a centralized one at the Board of Election, 4 regional centers, north, south, east, and west, say in the city of Columbus, and that was pretty much the case in the 9 urban areas. What Husted said, well, that's not fair. Vinton County only has 1, 10,000 members in that county. And so what happened there is you make it more difficult for minorities to vote. That's where you short the machines. That's where you make sure you've got your challengers. That's where you make sure you got your oldest machines, and you make sure there's no souls to the poll the Sunday before the Tuesday voting days. So that's what's going on, and these games are being played all over the United States because of the demographic tendencies. Okay, so there's more black people, more Hispanic people, more minorities, Asian Americans. You just got to make sure it's difficult for them to vote, and you deregister them.
Well, let me say, and I'm going to ask Steve to respond to that, but let me just say, it appears to me that between the African Americans, the Hispanics, the Asian Americans, and the Indigenous, who are actually significant in a number of congressional districts, those 4 groups have been absolutely driven away from the Republican Party with the vehemence and bad face of a marching army here. And so what do the Republicans have left to do but to hold on to a rigged voting system? Steve, is that reasonably accurate?
Well, you have to go state by state. Like for example, we're in 2018 in the South. Texas and Florida and Georgia were really very good examples of how close Democrats are to a tipping point if you have motivated campaigns. Beto O'Rourke in Texas got more than Obama got in terms of the percentage of the voter turnout. And, as far as today's politics, almost, I think every congressional district except one, I think, along the Mexican border, has a congressman, including one Republican, who opposes a wall. They're all
right.
Ones. They're all Democratic, and that's indicative of the shift. But Georgia is the current state that's the poster child for the most old-fashioned, rabid, nasty voter suppression tactics. Florida is different. I mean, the great tragedy of what happened to the Democrats in Florida was they had a late primary, and no one expected in August, and no one expected Andrew Gillum to win, and he wasn't able to get much of a campaign on the ground going. I mean, I was there, and this is what people said, and including people who were Democratic Party observers. That was completely different than Georgia, where Stacey Abrams was really fighting an incredible uphill battle against one of the most notorious vote suppressors who was running for governor against her, and he was also Secretary of State. So in Florida, you had a series of federal court rulings that basically said, you guys have created a process here where you're stopping a voter from participating in some way, whether it's fixing a signature on an absentee envelope or just a whole bunch of stuff where all of a sudden you're stopped dead in your tracks and you just can't cast a ballot that's got to count. And these federal judges said again and again, you can't do that. You've got to cure that. You got to make some allow some remedy here. Georgia, it's just was so much more layered. And by the way, the Republicans in these states are basically going by the same playbook. We read this week in Texas that the Secretary of State says that something like 90,000 people are illegally registered, and we're going to go out and investigate you. And that the Republican Party the Republicans in North Carolina said the same thing. Before Election Day, they had a U.S. attorney who was for the Eastern District, where most of the Latinos live, and he said, well, we think that people are illegally registered, and we're going to invest. And they tried to subpoena all the state records, including driver's licenses, because they're used for registration, going back 10 years. And I spoke to somebody who was the chief investigator for what was then a different state, Board of Election Director, Gary Bartlett, and his investigator, Marshall Tudor. He said that, this was completely, anti-Hispanic, race-based targeting. And by the way, he said that 10 years, that same guy who was, the Trump-appointed, U.S. prosecutor for the Eastern District of North Carolina, they brought an absentee ballot case to him 10 years ago when some guy was running for local office, and he was having somebody mail in and collect absentee ballots. This is the same guy, by the way, that was just involved in this congressional race. And the Republican and the prosecutor who they brought the evidence to, who refused to prosecute because it involved a Republican, is now the federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of North Carolina. They said that it's just incredible. This is the same guy, the same people, that are involved in that congressional race that's not resolved. And the candidate, by the way, who locally 10 years ago, who they did not end up prosecuting for this absentee ballot fraud, is the Republican president of the North Carolina State Senate. So this is how corrupt it is. This is how entrenched it is, and people can get away with this stuff mostly. And so you have these things where, like, okay, they're going fishing for tens of thousands of people's backgrounds in Texas. They're threatening Latinos in North Carolina. I mean, why are they doing all this? Well, because these states are at tipping points. But that's where we are.
Right. Wow. Amazing. Steve Rosenfeld, what's the name of your book?
The name of my book is called, the latest book, is called Democracy Betrayed, How Superdelegates, Redistricting, Party Insiders, and the Electoral College Rigged the 2016 Election.
If you can send me a PDF or something, I will review that. I'd like to see that.
Sure, sure.
And, I appreciate that.
It didn't get too many reviews because nobody wanted to hear the bad news when they thought a blue wave was coming.
Well, when we first reported this in Ohio, we were just trashed by everybody. And nobody wanted to hear this stuff, and the left just jumped all over us like we were a bunch of rubes from Ohio who didn't know what we were talking about. And to confirm how dumb we were, they called Bill Anthony, the Democratic guy. Bob, what happened to Bill Anthony? That all the lefties called to show how dumb we were.
Well, he was the secret source. The problem is he didn't hide real well. So he would be in town with somebody from the Nation, Mother Jones. And the whole thing, he was my key source. So he's leaking me information and begging me not to mention Franklin County screwed up, that he got snookered on the machines when Matt Damschroeder at the county hid the machines in the black inner city areas. So he's telling me about all these irregularities all over the state as a key source, and they're all citing him. In his official capacity, he's saying nothing went wrong. So on the side, he's the key source for the revelations of most of the irregularities. And I tried to explain that, but, these guys were from California and New York. I mean, they know everything.
Right. And our book is...
But you did have one big fan. Roger Stone called our last book a must-read in the Hill.
Well, we should send him a copy while he goes to prison.
He read it. He wrote a review. It's in the Hill, 2016. He called the strip and flip election a must-read.
Steve?
Well, these days, we should talk about this another time. What I've been really working on these days is to try to figure out how we can have verifiable vote counts and evidence trail based vote counts, because we're in a period where everybody who loses is going to accuse the other side of cheating, stealing, and everything. And the thing that I have mostly focused on in the last month... Oh,
no. We'll have to continue this. Steve Rosenfeld and Bob FITRAKIS, you guys are great. Thank you so much. Thank you, crew in New York. We'll be back next week, and we'll take this up again. Thank you, guys.
We got what we needed when the sun shone down.